Hello, everyone, and on behalf of our Registrar and CEO, Johnson Zuris, and the CMLTO Board of Directors, we thank you for making the time today to join us for our webinar. The purpose of today's webinar is to review CMLTO's role as a health regulator and its public protection mandate, to understand the process CMLTO uses to develop or revise its practice guidelines, to review and go over each of the 4 steps involved in the framework for evaluating professional practice activities, to identify and apply the framework through the use of some real-life situations or case studies, and finally, to ask questions about the framework to ensure its intent is understood and it's clear how it can be used in different situations. So first, let's review CMLTO's roles and responsibilities as a healthcare regulator. The RHPA, or Regulated Health Professions Act, is the umbrella legislation that governs all health regulatory colleges in Ontario. And under the RHPA, there are details regarding a college's objects to protect the public from harm, to promote high-quality care, and to ensure regulated healthcare professionals are accountable to the public. So it's the duty of the college to work in consultation with the minister to ensure that the people of Ontario have access to adequate numbers of qualified, skilled, and competent regulated health professionals. The RHPA is the same legislation that governs all health regulatory colleges in Ontario. It includes details such as how colleges are structured, our core public protection mandate, as well as other statutory responsibilities of the healthcare colleges. The CMLTO is one of 26 health regulatory colleges in Ontario, and there are a total of 29 health professions that are regulated. As I mentioned, under the RHPA, there are a series of objects that a college must strive to achieve. So the first object that relates to the development of guidelines is to promote and enhance relations between the college and its members, other health profession colleges, key stakeholders, and the public. The second object is to develop, establish, and maintain standards of knowledge and skill and programs to promote continuing evaluation, competence, and improvement among the members. And lastly, to develop, establish, and maintain standards and programs to promote the ability of members to respond to changes in practice environments, advances in technologies, and other emerging issues. The CMLTO's core mandate is public protection, and we do this through the 3-legged stool of regulation. So we have 3 core departments: registration, professional conduct, and quality assurance. We achieve our mandate of public protection through registration, meaning that we review applications to ensure they meet the requirements to practice in Ontario for all MLTs. Through professional conduct, we investigate acts of professional misconduct through complaints, mandatory reports, or self-reported non-compliances. And lastly, through the quality assurance program, we support registrants in continuously improving their practice. Now that we better understand the role of the CMLTO, we'll go into detail about the steps that we take to develop our practice guidelines. Professional practice guidelines are statements and resources that are developed to provide professionals with guidance in making decisions about practice situations while allowing the flexibility to use their own professional judgment. So guidelines focus on helping MLTs learn and apply decision-making tools to practice effectively. Practice guidelines cannot possibly cover all scenarios or situations, so it's important that MLTs and other stakeholders use these guidelines and understand their limitations. The nuanced and situation-specific information should always be thought through and considered when reflecting on our guidelines and resources. Professional practice guidelines are intended to support, they're not meant to replace MLT professional judgment. They're developed by CMLTO staff, working groups, and other stakeholders, which may include CMLTO registrants, our board and committee members, members of the public, and so on. They reflect both the public and professional interests, and they're maintained by the CMLTO, our board of directors, and its statutory committees in consultation with CMLTO registrants and stakeholders. There are key resources in legislation that are enforceable by law, and these include legislation such as the RHPA, the MLT Act, the Lab Licensing Act, and so on. And under these pieces of legislation, there are regulations. For example, under the MLT Act, there are two pieces of regulation: Ontario Regulation 207/94, which is the general regulation and includes details such as the registration requirements and the components of the quality assurance program and so on. And the second piece of regulation under the MLT Act is 752/93, and this is the professional misconduct regulation. Finally, we have the CMLTO consolidated bylaws, which detail various practice requirements such as professional liability insurance, board composition, and so on. Now, all of these components, the legislation, regulations, and bylaws are enforceable by law. Now, on the right-hand side, there are items that are not enforceable by law or CMLTO professional misconduct processes. And these include resources such as guidelines, such as the one that we're discussing today, position statements, e-bulletin, our newsletter focus, and those types of items. Now, this is an overview of the process that we use to develop our practice guidelines. These are the steps that we undertake to consider the development or revision of our practice guidelines. First, we need to identify whether the resource is needed and whether that need is valid or within our role and our mandate of public protection. We ask questions of whether our existing guidelines are having their intended impact, whether they continue to align with our mandate, and whether there are external resources that are available to the public. All of these questions help us to identify if there is a need for that particular guideline. After we've identified the need for or lack of need for a resource, we develop a guideline-specific approach for its revision or development. When a new guideline is developed, we may conduct further research on a topic to identify some best practices. We may ask registrants to participate in surveys to provide some feedback or comments. We may convene a working group to help in the guidelines development. The specifics for the development or revision or retirement of a guideline are carefully thought out and planned for. And finally, our resources are also reviewed by our legal counsel. The third step in this process includes that our guidelines are reviewed and approved by our relevant committees, and in some cases, our board of directors. When a guideline is created, rescinded, or revised, we communicate these changes out to our registrants and our various stakeholders through different means, such as Focus, which is our newsletter. We may send out e-blasts, and we also update our website. We share our resources with all relevant stakeholders, including the other health regulatory colleges, IQMH or Accreditation Canada, CSMLS, MLPAO, and others where appropriate. There are many inputs that are factored in when we're reviewing or developing our guidelines. These include professional practice inquiries that we receive from registrants, employers, and members of the public. And we also take a look at practice and risk trends to identify if there's a need to develop topic-specific guidance. Also internally, we take a look at risks that are applicable to each of the CMLTO departments, including the ones that I mentioned before, registration, professional conduct, and quality assurance. Now we'll dive into the framework itself that today's webinar is about for evaluating professional practice activities. One of the most common practice inquiries that we receive is related to whether MLTs are able to do a specific activity. And we've found that throughout the pandemic, the number of these inquiries rose, and this indicated to us that a resource would be helpful to registrants as well as other stakeholders and assist them in answering this type of question. Through our scope of practice surveys, we do recognize that MLTs and other laboratory practitioners' practice has and will likely continue to change. MLTs are most likely to transfer pre-analytical and analytical responsibilities to medical laboratory assistants and technicians, while MLTs are most likely to acquire supervisory tasks. Now, skill mix is used by employers differently across the province, and skill mix can be used to mitigate issues such as staffing or budget constraints. This guideline was created to help individuals in answering whether they can or whether they're allowed to do a certain activity. Now, this is the framework itself. As you can see, there are 4 steps. So the purpose of the framework, again, is to assist registrants, employers, and other stakeholders in answering the question, can I or am I allowed to do this activity? And often this question can be quite difficult to answer as there are many moving pieces and considerations. So we've developed this 4-step framework to assist those in asking this question to gather information to help them to make the best decision possible. Each framework has each step in the framework has a series of questions that the person can ask themselves to fully understand what the activity entails and who may be the best resource to perform this task. The first step of the framework relates to laws, regulations, and policies that form a practitioner's practice boundaries. So this one, the first step, is called restrictions. The first question here is the activity described in legislation, for example, the RHPA, Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Public Hospitals Act, the MLT Act, the Lab Licensing Act, and so on. Is the activity a controlled act listed in the RHPA under Section 27? So these questions really help to uncover whether delegation processes are required. If an individual does not have authorization to perform a controlled act, it must be delegated to them. The authorized individual is responsible for ensuring they follow their college's and other legislative requirements as it relates to the delegation process. It's important to note that conducting lab tests or laboratory tests is not a controlled act listed under the RHPA. However, in Section 30 of the RHPA, there is a general harm clause that states, no person other than a member treating or advising within the scope of his or her profession shall treat or advise a person with respect to his or her health in circumstances in which it's reasonably foreseeable that serious harm may result from the treatment or advice or from an admission from them. So all that to say, it's reasonable to assume that serious harm could result if laboratory testing was done by someone who did not have the knowledge, skill, or judgment to do it accurately and safely. The last question for this particular step in the framework focuses on internal policies and procedures. So are there existing organizational policies or processes, including SOPs, that describe who should or must perform this activity? So there may be existing policies already in place in your employment setting that set out who can do certain activities. And as I stated, it could include SOPs, it could include bargaining agreements in unionized settings, and it also could be included in employment contracts or job descriptions. The next step in the framework relates to risks. So we all know that risks are a fundamental component of all activities. This includes activities that are performed by laboratory practitioners who are both regulated and unregulated. Risks can be tangible, such as things including patient harm or MLT harm or harm to the individual performing the act, or intangible, such as risks to reputation. So the first question here, do I clearly understand the risks involved with this activity? Do I understand the potential quality or safety issues if this activity is performed by one individual instead of another? The risk identification process can and should be performed throughout an activities assessment. When a risk is identified, you must document it. Now for the third question, for those risks that you documented, do you have a plan if the risk occurs? So through that documentation process, it will help you to assist in thinking of ways to best handle or mitigate that risk from happening or lessening its impact if it does happen. If a risk isn't understood, there is potential for harm, and this could include patient harm or harm to the individual performing the activity. Another important piece is, do you know if this activity is covered by professional liability insurance? Are you aware of union or other department requirements and considerations related to this activity? So by engaging other stakeholder groups such as unions or other departments, it can help you to think of different risks and to understand their role in any risk mitigation strategies you may need to use. The third step in the framework relates to resources, in particular constraints and challenges. The medical laboratory science sector is often faced with resource constraints, and while these may differ between employers or from employer to employer, it's an important aspect of understanding what is required when performing a specific activity. It's not within the CMLTO's mandate to comment on employer-related issues and strategies for dealing with health human resources planning. It is the employers' and practitioners' responsibilities to understand and address the challenges that they're encountering. If you are reflecting on your ability to understand the resources related to a certain activity, you should consider these questions. Do I have the resources to mitigate the risks that you identified in the previous step? So this could include time, personnel, technology, and budget. Do I understand the resource implications for each risk mitigation strategy? Again, the strategies that you use to mitigate the risks that you've identified could include a cost, it could require specific individuals, and it will likely require time to implement. Do I know if a specific practitioner has the prerequisite knowledge, skills, or judgment to perform this activity safely and competently? Am I aware if this activity aligns to a practitioner's competency profile? So CSMLS has competency profiles available on their website for both MLTs and medical laboratory assistants and technicians. They may be useful resources when you're reflecting on if an individual has the prerequisite knowledge, skill, or judgment to perform an activity. And lastly, do I know which practitioner would be best equipped to perform this activity now and in the future? So future planning is a very important process in mitigating these challenges. Finding a long-term solution can enable you to avoid performing this process and using this framework over and over again. Now moving on to the last step in the framework, which is related to responsibilities and determining clear expectations and accountability processes. Oftentimes, tasks or activities can be intertwined with the work of others, and it's important that we understand where these interactions occur, as they may impact who the best individual is to perform a specific activity. For example, some activities that may be linked to financial obligations, they may be linked to impact test turnaround times. Perhaps the activity is related to reporting to someone else, including a supervisor. Or maybe the activity would require gathering data to inform another MLT's activities. Sometimes accountable parties are external to your organization as well, and can include entities such as the CMLTO and the Ministry of Health. These interactions and relationships should be considered. Some tools to assist stakeholders with this step in the framework could include process mapping, RACI charts, which is responsible, accountable, consult, and inform charts, organizational charts, and so on. Challenges really occur when there's no clear understanding of the activity's goal, what determines the activity's success, and the consequences if the activity is not performed adequately. So the questions related to this step in the framework include, do I know who this practitioner is accountable to? Do I understand my own accountability obligations within my organization? So again, it's important to understand and know where your position is within the accountability framework if you are assessing if someone else is capable of performing a task or activity. Have the activity's expected outcomes been clearly communicated to all stakeholders? Am I and others aware of the consequences and next steps to take in the event of an error or adverse outcome? Again, having clear expectations is an important aspect of both accountability structures and frameworks, as well as risk assessments. And lastly, am I confident the individual performing this activity fully understands the accountability structure and processes, including their role within it? Again, this question relates to understanding and ensuring consistency in that understanding across all stakeholders. All right, so now that we've gone over the framework, we're going to use two case study examples and see how this framework can be applied in real life situations. So case studies highlight examples of when and how the framework may be applied. These case studies do not consider the unique nuances of each employment setting or individual. The intent is to provide a basic overview of how to use the framework and ask the questions and to reflect on the potential answers. And again, individuals must perform due diligence and use their own professional judgment when determining if they or someone for whom they're responsible for should or can perform a specific activity. Under the RHPA, the collection of nasopharyngeal swabs, which means those that go past the narrowing of the nasal passage, is listed as a controlled act. So MLTs do not have the authority to perform this controlled act within the MLT Act. So therefore, delegation is required and must be in place before the MLT can perform this activity. Again, the actual controlled act itself is putting an instrument, hand, or finger beyond the point in the nasal passages where they normally narrow. And this is the sixth controlled act in the RHPA. So again, in order to proceed with this activity, you would need to have it delegated to you by someone who is authorized to perform this particular activity. Moving into the second step of the framework, which deals with risks. This section, just to remind everyone, includes questions such as, do I clearly understand the risks involved with performing this activity? Do I understand the potential quality or safety issues if this activity is performed by one individual instead of another? Do I have a plan if risks occur? Is this activity covered under professional liability insurance? So with this particular case study, there is possible risk for injury if the MLT misuses the swab when collecting the sample. There are also quality issues and testing reliability issues or risks if the swab is not collected in the appropriate manner. There may be risks to the MLT who is collecting the swab. For example, if they're unaware of where to find and how to use the appropriate personal protective equipment, they may be putting themselves at risk collecting these nasopharyngeal swabs. So all these are important considerations when reflecting upon risks related to this particular activity. The third step of the framework, again, relates to resource constraints and challenges. So if this individual performs this activity, will they be taken away from other important duties? For example, if this MLT is the sole practitioner who can perform complex antibody investigation, which of these two activities would take precedent? And do you have staff that can mitigate or manage this gap if this person is gone to collect nasopharyngeal swabs? Also, if one of the safety risks that I mentioned in step 2 of the framework, such as lack of PPE, will the MLT be able to access it somewhere else? An important question to ask in this scenario is whether there is another resource who perhaps can already collect these samples and may be better suited for this activity. For example, physicians and nurses have access to this controlled act. So is there a more suitable resource that's already available to you? And lastly, Will this MLT collect swabs for the short term, or will this become part of their day-to-day duties? Will this require an adjustment to their job description to accommodate for these changes? All of these different factors are very, very important to consider when reflecting on resource constraints and challenges related to this particular activity. And for the fourth step of this framework, related to responsibilities and accountabilities. Now, in this particular case study, it's a major aspect of this situation. So if something goes wrong, is the MLT equipped to handle this situation? Are they working independently, or are they working in a team setting? If this individual may require first aid and CPR training, as they're directly interacting with patients, and this is to ensure they can safely and competently handle emergencies if they arrive. So does this MLT already have that training in place? In terms of a reporting structure, will this MLT be reporting to their laboratory manager, or is there another department manager that they're responsible to now since they've acquired this task? Now, all of these questions are very important and they're very nuanced to each individual employment setting. So that concludes the first case study, and now we'll go into the second one. So performing quality control testing is not a controlled act listed under the RHPA. It is possible that harm may arise if it's not done or monitored correctly, so the individual should be able to demonstrate their knowledge, skill, and judgment when performing this activity. You would need to ensure compliance with the training and competency requirements from organizations such as Accreditation Canada and CAP, or the College of American Pathologists. Organizations may already have these policies and processes in place that direct a certain laboratory practitioner to complete the quality control tests. So you should also reference your SOPs or other policies and processes that you have in place. For example, there may be a quality assurance technologist who's responsible for this task, or a quality manager who is responsible for conducting or supervising this type of work. Now, risk related to this particular case study. There may be risks if this activity is not performed correctly. So for example, if an analyzer's quality control is out of the acceptable limits and the individual responsible is uncertain what to do next, perhaps there may be delays in patient testing. Alternatively, there may be equipment risks if the proper reagents or tests are not run under the required conditions. So again, the training and competency checks in this particular process would be very important to mitigate those risks. Again, it's important to reflect on and assess the laboratory or in the employment settings constraints and challenges. There may be already a resource there who has QC knowledge and experience. In reviewing a practitioner's competency profile, it may indicate to you if one individual is more qualified than another, and you should reflect on the frequency of running QC as well. So one consideration is, are there staff available on each shift to run the QC? Is there a particular staff member that's responsible, or is it a particular role that's delegated across shifts? So again, that's an important consideration when looking at resources. And lastly, the last step in this framework, responsibilities. The accountability framework here is very important for this example. If there is an error with the QC, does this individual understand what the appropriate next steps are? Are the processes in place to ensure ongoing competency checks in performing this task? If an MLT is supervising this individual, do they understand their accountability requirements? Are the requirements meaning acceptable versus not acceptable limits clearly detailed? And does this individual understand what those mean? So it's important that all stakeholders involved in a particular activity understand their roles and responsibilities. And this may include multiple practitioners, from the actual medical laboratory assistant and technician that's doing the test, to a supervising MLT, to the lab manager. Each of those have their own accountability and responsibilities in this particular example. Thank you for attending CMLTO's webinar on the guidelines for evaluating professional practice activities. If you have any questions, please email registrantrelations@cmlto.com. Thank you.